Good morning. Let me invite you to grab your Bibles with me and turn to Genesis chapter 25. We are in a series called Portraits of Christ. This morning we will spend our time looking together at mildly familiar, I suppose, account of God wrestling with a man named Jacob. Jacob and Esau, you may recall, are twin brothers, sons of Isaac. Jacob's a bit of a cheat his whole life. His brother Esau doesn't take kindly to being cheated by him, and they go their separate ways under threat of death for the better part of 20 years. And then Esau and Jacob are going to end up with a rather ill-fated family reunion. And the night before the family reunion, where Jacob thinks that Esau very well may follow up on the promise to kill him, God meets Jacob in the middle of the night and wrestles with him. And it's a very, very odd account. And God wrestles with him, and it seems as though God feigns weakness in order to let him win, only to then touch his hip, wound him for the rest of his life, and the next day, Jacob meets Esau, and away the story goes. Now, you cannot understand that story unless you understand all of the preceding stories that come before it. And so what we're going to do this morning, I think, because I haven't preached this one yet, I'll have a better idea of it for second service, but I think what we're going to do this morning is actually spend more of our time on the other stories, the arc of the story of Jacob's life, and then actually spend less time on the text of the morning. But you won't understand the text of the morning unless you understand the arc of the story. Commentators are basically universally agreed on this, which they never universally agree on anything. But the wrestling of Jacob with God that night is near the Jabbok tributary, which flows into the Jordan River. That is the most significant event of his life. That's where everything changes for him. And so that's like the climax or the culmination of his story, and then everything turns for the better after that. And you will not get that, kind of like launching into the most climactic scene of a movie. You won't get it unless we look at what came before. So what I'll invite you to do is turn with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 25. Genesis chapter 25. And I want us to understand, again, the arc of the story of Jacob's life, and then we'll spend probably less time in Genesis 32, but by then we'll have this thing pretty well sorted out. Genesis 25. I want to remind you that we are not here to have Alex entertain us or tell us stories or motivate us. That is not why we are here. We are here because God has given us His Word, and it is our joy to gather on the Lord's Day together and to look into His Word together. So some of you are planning right now. You're like, I'm going to sit here and I'm just going to listen to Alex talk. That is a very bad idea. What you should be saying is, I am going to open my Bible. Some of you are like, I don't have one. Great, there's one in a pew rack nearby. Grab it. Genesis is the first book in the Bible, and let's do this thing. So you're in Genesis, beginning in chapter 25, and I'll pick it up in verse 21. Isaac. Now, do we remember who that is? Isaac is Abraham's son. Isaac is the guy from last week who went up on the hill and almost died. Him. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. She cannot have children. That's very similar, by the way, to Isaac's mom, Sarai, if you recall that. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children, plural, the children struggled together within her. You could say wrestled within her. And she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? In other words, that's first-time mother for what is going on here. She doesn't necessarily know what's going on at this moment, but the babies inside of her are wrestling. So why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, this is very significant, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, Now, if you have twins inside of you, and God says one will be stronger than the other, you don't even need God to say the next thing, because you already know the one who will be stronger than the other, the older, will be stronger than the younger. That's how these things work, usually. But then God says, what's that word? Oh, okay. So we're looking together at the end of verse 23, and I'm going to read, and I'm going to ask you to participate. It will not kill you. What's that word? Older. Okay, so that was like maybe slightly better. Shall serve the younger. So the older one will serve the younger. That's not how this usually works. It's how it's about to work, though. Here we go, verse 24. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. I mean, if you have to say that someone's hairy, they're probably really hairy. I'm just, that's not, just whatever. You do with that what you will. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding on to Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. That word, the name Jacob means heel grabber, but it's more like trickster. Like grabbing onto taking somebody by the heel, heel grabber, but really, really like trickster, kind of conniver, and you're going to see that borne out in his life here in a moment. Watch this, verse 28. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game. So Esau, he's got that bow, he's got them arrows, he's out shooting stuff, and he's feeding his dad. Dad's like, Esau's my guy. However, Rebekah loved Jacob. So if that sounds like family dysfunction to you, it's because it is. We continue. Verse 29. Once, when Jacob was cooking stew. So they're older now, right? This isn't one infant cooking stew for another infant. We have fast forwarded now. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. He's a man of the land out there running around. And Esau said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted. Therefore his name was called Edom, which means red. Jacob said, sell me your birthright now. So do we know why Jacob's name was called trickster? Just going to take it, just going to take it. Brother's about to die, been out doing whatever he was doing in the woods. Esau's like, I'm going to die. I need some stew. Yeah, just give me your birthright. Esau said, I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? Now you have to understand, this isn't like where your kids say, Dad, if we don't eat at Burger King, I'm literally going to die. It's not that. He is, it seems, at the end of his strength. At the end of his strength. And so he's hungry. And rather than his brother just being kind and giving him some stew, his brother's like, I got an angle here. I'm going to work this angle. Give me your birthright, you can have some stew. Jacob said, swear to me now. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Now watch what Moses, who's writing this, does for us here. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Esau despised his birthright. So Jacob took advantage of him, yes, but Esau despised his birthright. Chapter 26, the camera kind of pans back onto Isaac. Isaac ends up lying to a guy about the fact that his wife is actually his sister. If that sounds familiar, it's because it should sound familiar. The sins of the father reflected by the son, that's what's happening there. You continue reading, though, and you get down to Genesis 27. So far, we see boys in their mother's womb wrestling with each other. We have a prophecy from the Lord that the older will serve the younger. Then we see Jacob tricking his brother, or at least taking advantage of him by giving him stew in exchange for his older brother's birthright. Genesis 27, verse 1. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, so he's getting near the end of his life, he called Esau his older son and said to him, my son. Now, remember, Esau is his favorite son. Esau is also the older son. And in light of the prophecy that was given to Rebekah, and you have to imagine by extension Isaac, watch what happens. My son, he answered, here I am. Verse 2, he said, behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, to be specific, and go out into the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. Now, Rebekah was listening. That's Isaac's wife. And her favorite is not Esau. Her favorite is Jacob. Good. Now, Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went out to the field to hunt for the game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats so that I may prepare for them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat so that he may bless you before he dies. Jacob, the trickster, is even like, Mom, we may have outdone ourselves. Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, so that's a problem, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me or touch me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing. His mother said to him, let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go bring them to me. What ends up happening, as some of you know this story, is that Rebekah pulls it off, takes the goats, cooks them, sends Jacob into his father who cannot see well. Isaac has a very strange experience because he's like, you don't sound like my son, Jacob. You sound like my son, Esau. But it ends up working. He smells the smell of his clothing because and Rebekah made took animal skins and put them on his arm to cover up for the hair. I mean, this thing was perfectly deployed. So Isaac ends up blessing Jacob, who is, again, the younger one, not the older one. And then, it's like he leaves out the tent door this way, and right after he leaves, here comes Esau in the tent door. He's like, Dad, got it, done, here it is. And Dad's like, well, then who did I just bless if you're Esau? Genesis 27 and verse 36. Esau said, after he got ripped off, is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. First, he took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. Then he said, have you not reserved a blessing for me? And then Isaac goes on to basically say, son, I don't have another one, but he gives him a blessing, and basically it's the fulfillment of God's original design. Verse 41, now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching. That's another way of saying my dad's going to die soon. Then I'm going to kill my brother Jacob. That's how he's going to sort this out. Rachel comes to Jacob again, verse 43. My son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban, my brother. So Rachel's brother's name is Laban. Flee to Laban, my brother, and stay with him a while. In the Hebrew, I believe that's like a few days. So not a long time. Just stay there for a while. Esau will get over it, and then you can come back. Now, when you read that and you study that out, it is difficult to conclude that anybody in that whole story is actually doing the right thing. Isaac is trying to bless the son that is not the son of blessing. He's trying to do that. Isaac wants to give all of the primary blessing to the firstborn, which is Esau, not Jacob. So that's not good. Rebekah is coming in and being a trickster and a conniver. That's not good. Jacob goes along with it. That's not good. And Esau's like, I'm just going to kill him. Also not good. And yet in this, you have to wrestle through, and this is not the main point of the sermon, but it is worth thinking out. You have to wrestle through the fact that nobody in that account is walking in righteousness, and yet the righteous plans of God are going to prevail anyway. And God's not, by the way, saying, oh, it's fine, Rebecca, just rip everybody off. And yeah, Isaac, try to reverse my plan. And yeah, Jacob, help me out. None of that. And yet the sovereign plan of God will be worked out. So we have to speed up here. So what ends up happening is Jacob goes down to Laban, which is his uncle. And he shows up. And there's a well there with a rock rolled over it, and some shepherds show up. And it ends up being that he's like, hey, let's water the sheep, Jacob. Like, let's water the sheep. And they're like, well, we can't water the sheep because we need all the shepherds here to help us roll away the stone. And then a shepherdess shows up, and her name is Rachel, and she just so happens to be Laban's daughter, the younger daughter. And Jacob sees her, and he's like, it normally takes a group of people to remove the stone. It's not a problem. He walks up, rolls the stone away, waters the sheep, ends up finding out who she is, and then he sobs his eyes out, heads over, bawls his eyes out. You can read that. Heads over to meet Laban. Verse 15. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Because he's going to stay with him for a while, and he's going to work for him. Laban's like, I'm a good uncle. I'm going to pay you. Should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be? Verse 16. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak. That actually probably means she wasn't that attractive. Like, it could mean she has a problem with her eyes, but it might mean she's hard on the eyes. You can go sort that out if you want to. That is honestly what it seems to mean. But Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. Laban's like, deal. So what ends up happening is that Jacob serves those 7 years. And to him, he loves her so much, they're like just a couple days, like that. I mean, he's so in love with her. And what ends up happening then is that the 7 years are ended, and Jacob's like, Uncle Laban, give me your daughter to be my wife because I love her. And so Laban's like, okay, I'll be a man of my word. Except for what ends up happening instead is that in the night, and exactly how this happened, you can I'll leave to your imagination to sort it out. Somehow it happens that Laban brings Leah instead of Rachel, and Jacob ends up marrying her. And now what we see is that Jacob's a trickster, and his mom has a little bit of trickery in her. But Laban might even be a bigger conniver, a bigger trickster, a bigger deceiver even than Jacob himself. He's getting a little bit of a taste of his own medicine. So Jacob ends up realizing, like, holy smokes, somehow I have married the wrong one. Verse 26, Laban says, it is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. I think, now I wasn't there, but I think that Jacob just said to himself, uh-oh. Because what has Jacob done his whole life? What he's done his whole life is he has tried to usurp the birth order. And Laban goes, that's not how we do it around here. You can't have the younger unless you first take the older. Very dishonest, very conniving, wrong, but that's what he said. And I think Jacob probably just said, uh-oh. I think I am eating a good dose of my own medicine. So Laban, always the salesman, is like, listen, we can fix this. Work for me 7 more years, and then you can have Rachel. So that's what happens. So he gets Rachel. He works another 7 years. For those of you keeping track of the math at home with your calculator, that would be 14 years now that he is there working. And you might be able to smell a whiff of greater levels of family dysfunction going on here. It gets absolutely almost unbelievable. You can read and continue reading through chapter 30, not right now, because right now we're working our way, but you can keep reading about these children who are born and the competition between the two sisters who don't seem to like each other very much, and it's like a baby producing competition. It is absolute insanity, and yet the plan of God continues to unfold. Chapter 30, I need to point your attention to verse 25. As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, so there's a bunch of sons now who have been born, but here we're catching up toward the end. As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my home and country." Now, remember, his home and his country, right? Mom, after she ripped off Esau and Dad, was like, "Hey, Jacob, Esau's not happy about this. Just leave for a couple of days and then come back." Well, 20 some odd years later, Jacob's going, after seeing all of the tension in his own home and tension between he and Laban, which has always been there for a bunch of really obvious reasons, he's like, "I gotta go home. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service that I have given you." Laban says, "But if I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination," that's not great, "that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He's like, "I can't let you leave, nephew, because you have brought a lot of blessing upon me." Now, I just have to speed up here. I was going to read more of this, but we got to keep moving. What ends up happening is that they have a little bit of disagreement there going, and then finally, Jacob's like, "No, I just need to leave. Give me my wages." So Laban's like, "Okay," always the trickster, by the way. "Okay, how about this? You go through the flocks, and all of the speckled animals you can have, all the ones that are speckled." And Jacob's like, "Okay, fine, deal. Like, you've ripped me off so many times. I just need to get out of here. Give me all the speckled ones. That's what we'll do." Except for while he's doing that, like he apparently texts Laban, sends a text message to one of his other shepherds, one of his sons, and he's like, "Hey, go through the flocks and get all the speckled animals out of here as quickly as you can. Send them 3 days that way." So you can see here, again, Laban ripping off his son-in-law, and it only gets worse from there. It ends up being that God works it out to where Jacob ends up leaving Laban with a bunch of livestock and riches, but he leaves secretly. He actually tricks him, is Laban's language. Laban catches back up with him. I'm really speeding up now. Laban catches back up with him, and they sort of have a peacemaking little conversation, and they agree to never cross a certain barrier to ever harm one another, and they sort of go on their separate ways. Now, if you're Jacob, you're like, "Holy smokes, I am finally out from under my crazy uncle, who also happens to be my father-in-law," probably not a great combination, "and I am out of here now, finally." Except for in his mind, his bigger problem still lies out in front of him, because 20 years ago, his brother Esau, who tends to be a little bit of a angry, maybe short fuse sort of a human being, said he was going to kill him, and Jacob is not so sure that Esau has forgotten about the thing that he did to him. It is in that context that we come to Genesis chapter 32 for a very, very, very awkward family reunion. I'll begin reading in verse 3 just to set this up for you. Jacob, so he's broken away from Laban. His wives are there, his children are there, all these messengers, all of this livestock. Jacob sent messengers, verse 3, Genesis 32, messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, Thus says your own servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, female servants. I have sent to tell my Lord in order that I may find favor in your sight." Translation, Esau, I've been gone for 20, you may have noticed. While I was away, I acquired a lot of wealth, and what he ends up doing is he's going to send a bunch of it. Well, let's continue. The messengers return to Jacob, so he's got the plan. The messengers go say this. The messengers return to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you. Uh-oh. And there are 400 men with him. Now, that usually would translate to, we're about to get trashed. You don't bring 400 men to like, hey man, let me help you carry all your stuff. We'll all hug you and sing Kumbaya. That's not what that would indicate. 400 men are with him. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, verse 7. He divided the people who were with him in the flocks and the herds and the camels into two camps, thinking, if Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. Then Jacob prays, and this is a very good idea, verse 9. O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed the Jordan. That was when I was leaving. And now I am on my return, and I've become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Cannot be numbered. Now I'll tell you what's so fascinating about that. And then we're almost to the text of the morning, and I promise you we will not be here much longer. What's so fascinating about that is all you've really seen out of Jacob from this point is nothing you would want to see in yourself or see in any of your sons. Like, right? I hope not. I mean, if you want your son to just be able to sell salt to a slug, Jacob is your guy. But if you want him to be an upstanding, good dude, caring for that's not him. And what has happened, if you go back and read these chapters in their entirety, I would encourage you to do that. I did it a bunch of times preparing for this sermon. If you go back and read those chapters that we just flew over in their entirety, what you'll see is you'll see Jacob being an absolute train wreck, and yet God will come to him on a few different occasions and say, I'm going to bless you. Through you, the promise to Abraham, the promise to Isaac, through your family line, the nations will be blessed. There will be a multitude of offspring who will come from your line. And now Jacob prays. I mean, if we're honest, 32 beginning at 9, that's a really good prayer, a really good one, taken at face value. And I'm not saying don't take it at face value. I'm just saying that kind of prayer typically doesn't seem to be a reflection of a guy like that. And yet that's sort of the conundrum that we all live in, right? We're all this broken work in progress, if we're honest. And yet, Jacob prays that really beautiful prayer, and then he gets together basically a dowry. He takes all of his wealth, divides it out into various waves, and then sends the wealth out in front of him. And he's basically saying, hey, Esau, I'll buy you off, watch. So then he sends wave after wave. The plan is to send these different waves of gifts to sort of soften and hopefully make his brother and the 400 men with him less angry as wave after wave of cash money shows up. That's the plan. Which brings us to Genesis 32 and verse 22. So the present has gone, the gift has gone before him. Verse 22, the same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. Now, that's not a great idea. The Jabbok, you probably all know this, but it's a tributary feeding into the Nile River. And it's very, very steep and really rocky and pretty barren and destitute. And most people think it was pretty fast flowing, so trying to cross it in the middle of the night with a bunch of little kids, probably not a great idea. You can read into that however far you want to. I tend to think that there's probably just a level of anxiety going on with Jacob right now that might even have him doing some irrational things out of the weight that he carries from this impending family reunion. Verse 23, he took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And then I want to look at this account in these three movements. First, the wrestling. The wrestling. Now, before I read the next verse, I want to point out in this idea of the wrestling, Jacob had been wrestling his whole life. In the womb of his mother and all the way through. Wrestling. You could say, even if you wanted to, enmity, conflict. And so there he is in the middle of the night. He has gotten his family, certainly underneath the hand of God, safely across this tributary. And Jacob was left alone, verse 24. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw, watch this, that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." He said, the mysterious wrestler said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men." The name Israel means one who strives with God. You have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Not exactly helpful if you're about to go engage in combat with your older brother, but limping because of his hip. "Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh." So we look at this in three movements. First, the wrestling. Now, again, Jacob had been wrestling his whole life. Who's he wrestling with? Well, he tells you, I'm going to name this place, I have seen God. Who's he wrestling with? Well, it's God. Now, the reference can be to an angel of the Lord, but where you see angel of the Lord, and in this instance, he says, I've seen God face to face. I agree. It's not only a theophany, a vision of God, but more specifically, it's likely a Christophany, a pre-incarnate view of Jesus. I think that you could safely say that the second member of the Trinity shows up in the middle of the night, jumps Jacob, and says, "We're going to wrestle a while, you and I." The wrestling. Now, it's interesting, and one of the things you got to really think out here, the man that he's wrestling with is not prevailing against Jacob. You see that in verse 25? He's not prevailing against Jacob. And that causes a lot of people to think a lot of various things. I'll tell you what I make of that. What I make of that is this is what fathers do. God is not weak. Now we know Jacob is strong. He could roll the stone away by himself. I mean, he's a shepherd, a herdsman. Like, we know that he's strong, but you would be gravely mistaken to think that Jacob and Jesus are evenly matched. What's happening here is God is feigning weakness. This is what fathers do. Fathers will arm wrestle their sons and let the son for a moment think that the son might win until the father then slams the son's knuckles into the table just to demonstrate. This is what happens anytime my children challenge me to a Nerf war. I have purchased all of their weaponry. I have given them the tactical advantage down in the basement. They have established fire superiority, and I will come down and it gets old, honestly, shooting them all in the face. And so finally I'm like, okay, and I let them shoot me a couple of times. But they would be mistaken, and they sometimes do make this mistake, to think that they are better with a Nerf gun than me. They're not. This is what fathers do when they wrestle on the floor with their boys. I did this yesterday. Dominated both of them. But after a while, that gets old, and so you let them feel as though they stand a chance, only to then dominate them again, to just prove to them they can't even trust their own instincts. And so that's what's happening here. God is feigning weakness and wrestling with Jacob and not crushing him as he deserves. You're like, okay, Alex, I get all the father analogies, but where are you getting that from? Well, I'll tell you exactly where I'm getting it from. I get it from verse 25. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, you're like, yeah, see, he's winning. Wait, he touched his hip. Touched it. Like he touched it. He didn't armbar him. He didn't whatever, all this other craziness, choke him out. He didn't finally get the upper hand. He just went, we're done here. Boink. And when he touched his hip, Jacob's hip ended up with a wound that he would walk with for the rest of his life. When God wanted the thing to be over, it became over. The wrestling, number one, and two, the wounding. God touched his hip. He touched his hip. And in touching his hip, Jacob would then walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The fight takes a dramatic turn at that point because Jacob's hip is put out of joint as he wrestled him. Verse 26, then he said, let me go. The man says, let me go, for the day has broken. I do think that what you have happening here is the sun is beginning to rise, and the man knows you cannot see God and live. The day has broken, but Jacob said, I'll not let you go until you bless me. So Jacob has gone from wrestling to now clinging. From wrestling and prevailing to getting touched in the hip and going, all I can do now is hang on for dear life. But if I now must hang on for dear life, bless me. Bless me. Now there's a bunch of significance to that. And I want to tease that out a bit more in a moment. God touched him and wounded him. And now number 3, here's the blessing. All I'm going to do now, God, is hold on to you and cling to you. You have demonstrated your power over me. You have wounded me. And now I'm going to cling to you until you bless me. So then God says, what is your name? As if he needed to know. But this is more for Jacob's benefit than God's. Jacob, heel grabber. Jacob, trickster. Jacob, conniver. Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, God says, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. You have won. That's what that means. You have won. Now here's what you have to understand. You got to think about that one. I've thought about it a bunch. How is it that he could say that he had won? How is it that God could say, you've striven with me and men and have won? Because if you look at it, God's about to leave, and Jacob is going to, after hanging on to God for dear life, after being touched by God to where his hip came out of the socket, Jacob is now going to walk away from this event limping. Nobody looks at that and concludes that Jacob won that fight. He will be marked by a limp for the rest of his life. All his opponent had to do was touch him, and he absolutely wounded him and won the fight. And then, as Jacob clings to this mysterious wrestler for dear life, he says, bless me, which is an acknowledgement of superiority. And yet God says, you won. Here's what I make of that. When it comes to God, you win by losing. When it comes to God, you win by losing. That's the only way you win with God. The only way you win with God is to lose. I'm not saying the only way you win with God is to let him win, because he doesn't need your help in letting him win. But there is a point in the life of every single person who has ever truly encountered God where you run up a white flag of surrender and you say, God, you win. Like, I'm done. You have wounded me, and I will now cling to your shoestrings for dear life, begging you by your grace to bless me. Which brings us to these 4 very quick observations, and we're done this morning. Number 1, Jacob spent much of his life trying to steal what was already his. Do you know that? Jacob spent the majority of his life stealing, conniving, doing all of those things to get what was already his. Before the boys were born, God's covenant love rested on Jacob. Before the boys were born, God said, the older is going to serve the younger. The younger will be blessed. And yet Jacob spent much of his life trying to steal what was already his. You do not need to help God out, friend. Brother or sister, you do not need to help God out. No good will ever come from you trying to grab hold of the plan of God and rework it in a way to help him out. He does not need your help, number one. Number two, it becomes clear as we get our way through the narrative that Jacob was actually Jacob's biggest problem. Not Isaac, his dad, who failed to bless him and see the blessing of God on his life. Not Rebekah, his mom. Not Laban. Not his wives who can't get along. Not Esau. Jacob was Jacob's biggest problem. Number three, God loved Jacob enough to pursue. It is God who goes after him. He's there in the middle of the night by the Jabbok River trying to figure out what he's going to do tomorrow about Esau, and a mysterious man shows up. It just so happens the mysterious man is the second member of the Trinity who did not have to show up that night, but God pursues his own. And so God loved Jacob enough to pursue him, to wrestle with him, to wound him, and to bless him. And the wound is a wound of grace. It's a wound of grace. It may not feel like grace. It probably hurt badly. But it was a wound of grace. Because when God wounded Jacob, what Jacob stopped doing is relying on himself. And what he started doing is depending on God. That will almost always come by way of wounding. And that will be one of the greatest gifts that God ever gives you if he teaches you to rely on him and not on you. Jacob limps. David prays over the bones that God had broken. Psalm 51, Paul has a thorn that he prays 3 times that the Lord would take from him. And all 3 times God says back to him, I will not take the thorn, but I will give grace. And you have to understand that when it comes before you and the Lord, weakness is strength. You have to be weak in order for him to be strong. Because he's strong regardless, but if you think you're strong, you leave no room for his strength. God's like, have it your way. But when you, by grace, experience a wounding, which everyone I have ever met who walks with Jesus experiences woundings and limps, when that happens, you run to him and his grace for strength rather than to what you think you bring to the table, which, if we're honest, is nothing good. And number four, the next time that God comes in weakness, he will receive the wounds so that we can receive the blessing. Now, do you understand that? This will not be the last time that God will show up and feign weakness. No, when the second member of the Trinity, by way of an incarnation in a spectacular virgin birth, comes into the world, he will walk about in weakness. You could say he will walk with a limp. You could say, as has been prophesied, he will be wounded for the transgressions of his people. And he will be wounded so that we can receive grace. If you don't learn to see the evidences of grace, the evidences of the grace of God in the woundedness that comes into your life from his sovereign hand, in light of the wounds that Christ received on the cross, you will never make sense of your wounds. But if you see God condescending to this trickster, this sinful, broken man named Jacob, and wrestling with him, but not giving him what he actually deserves, which is destruction and curse, but rather a wound of grace and blessing. And if you cannot from there see that what Christ does for us through his perfect life and horrible death and victorious resurrection is literally the exact same thing. He comes in weakness, and he comes to be wounded so that we can, by faith in him, experience the grace of his strength. Which brings us, I think, finally, to the table this morning. The time when we, as a blood-bought family of God, by faith looking to Jesus Christ, come to these elements, the bread and the cup, And as we're looking to God by faith, we're mindful of his weakness. We're mindful of his wounds. We're mindful of the fact that he has, in an absolute scandal, chosen to not give us what we deserve. We're mindful that he has wrestled with us. And by all accounts, let us win, so that we could be brought near to him and experience his grace. Father, we praise you for Jesus, for the work that he did on the cross for us, for the fact, God, that it did not seem too small a thing for you to appear weak so that we could be strong, to take what we deserve and give us what only you deserve. God, to even allow us to fight against you as so many of us have, only to overcome us, not by wrath, but by mercy and grace. Father, would you let us live in the tension this morning of your weakness and your wounds so that we can receive mercy and grace? God, would the bread and the cup remind us of those things? God, would we see that someday the King comes back and he will not come in weakness, but he will come in strength and wrath, and that we must flee to him and hide in him? God, would we learn from Jacob's example that the way in which we win is by losing with you? God, by your Spirit, would you cause many men and women in this room to surrender to you this morning, to stop trying to outsmart you and run from you and trick you and hide from you, but that they would see that you have run them down by the preaching of your word, and that you have been wounded in their place so that they can be healed. God, do that, we pray, in the name of Jesus. Amen. For those of you who are followers of Jesus, we invite you to come and take of the bread and the cup. We're doing it slightly differently now, as you'll probably notice here if you haven't already. There's a piece of bread in the tray, take it. There is a cup of juice in the other tray, take it. And then you can head back to your seat and remember the broken body and the shed blood of our great King.